Good morning, church.
Good morning.
I must admit to you that I have been often confused about why the Transfiguration is in the Gospel stories. And the reason I am confused is that I read the Transfiguration as, among other things, a great expression of the glory of God shining on Jesus and about Jesus. And there is an editor in me, a storyteller, an editor in me that thinks we already know this about Jesus. Jesus has already performed miracles by this point in all the gospel accounts. And in the gospel accounts, we have at the beginning of his ministry baptism, in which various versions of the glory of God is clearly on and about and around Jesus at the time of Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. So, in terms of understanding the people around him and us as readers understanding, yes, the glory of God is with Jesus, we already know this. We know this. At the end of the story, we have the resurrection. And what is more glorious than the resurrection? So Jesus already, we know, has tons of glory. So why the Transfiguration? Why do we need in the middle of the story this scene with Peter, James, and John? One important reason, I think, has to do with the story of Elijah and Elisha, which is one reason why they're together in our lectionary. You know, Elisha didn't need to see Elijah brought up in the whirlwind to heaven. Didn't need to see the chariot of fire. In fact, if you go back to the text there, Elijah says, that's it, we're going to say our goodbye here. Let me go on my own. Elijah is essentially asking Elisha to say goodbye, say their goodbyes, tearfully, whatever, and then let Elijah go and be taken up to God alone, just between Elijah and God. And Elisha says, no, as you live, as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will stay with you. And this happens 3 times. Now Elijah is, in his lifetime, already recognized as an incredibly important person, an important prophet. And Elisha, as his main disciple, Elisha's job is to do what Elijah says. When Elijah, of all people, says, Elisha, do this, Elisha does it. That's what Elisha is supposed to do. And here in this story, at the end of Elijah's life, Elisha doesn't do what he's told here. I think that is so interesting. Elisha keeps with Elijah all the way until the end. And I think part of the purpose of this is so that Elisha can see the chariot of fire and the horses and the whirlwind. Now, once Elisha sees this stuff, what does he do? Does he just say, wow, that's amazing, there is the glory of God? He might, but what the text gives us is he rends his clothes. He is in sorrow. The reason he has said no to his master 3 times is because he loves his master. He is sorry that his master is going. Yes, there are chariots of fire. There's a whirlwind. There are things that people live their whole lives along to see. And Elisha is sorrowful because this person he loves is going away. It's the end of their time together, at least in this life. It reminds me of the question that we sometimes ask. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Now, I've always heard that and thought, oh, of course it makes a sound. The scientist in me thinks, yeah, it falls, it makes sound waves. But that's not the point of that, is it? The point is about, is there someone there to witness? Is there someone there to observe? Is there a human being there, right? Because you think, there are animals in the forest. There are probably animals who hear the tree fall. But that's not quite what that's about. Is there a person there to see the tree fall and hear the tree fall? And I think about Elijah being taken up and seeing the chariot of fire and the whirlwind. It's important that Elisha is there. And it's important not just for Elisha, but for us, the readers and hearers of that story. It is important for us to see there is love between these two people. There is love between Elijah and Elisha. And it is sad. It is very sad that their time is ending. Elijah's basically dying. And in the midst of that sorrow, there is this glory of God. Now, there's glory of God there in the end of Elijah's life, not because Elijah is designated to be more special than Elisha, more special than anybody else. It is because Elijah has aligned himself throughout his life with the will of God. The glory of God is not saying, Elijah's better than you, so he gets a chariot of fire. The chariot of fire is about Elijah has paid attention to God's will. Elijah has aligned himself with God. Now let's go back to the Transfiguration then. Think about the end of Jesus' life. Does Jesus get a chariot of fire when he dies? No. Jesus is crucified. Jesus dies in sorrow, in suffering, and, boy, the disciples leave him, do they not? The male ones, anyway. The women are there at the cross, if I remember correctly. Jesus dies in suffering. There are not a group of prophets following him around. There's not a chariot of fire. There's not a whirlwind. And frankly, with these two stories together, I may ask God, where was the chariot of fire at the crucifixion? Was Jesus not worthy of a whirlwind and chariots and horses of fire? Why? Why, oh God, did you let Jesus just die on that cross? Was he not as worthy as Moses and as worthy as Elijah? Two things. I think the Transfiguration is part of the message of saying, Jesus is as important as Moses, important as Elijah, at least. The Transfiguration is a bit of a pre-chariot of fire for Jesus. And it's important that Peter, James, and John are there to see it. They don't know about the resurrection yet. Jesus has told them. They don't understand it. He makes that clear. So for them, this is their best clue that they should really be paying attention to. If you look at the gospel, the voice from the cloud says, "This is my beloved, listen to him." And that is incredibly important. Remember what I said about Elijah and the chariot of fire? That happened because Elijah was a good prophet, aligning himself with God, and you should listen to what Elijah said. Moses and Elijah are with Jesus in the Transfiguration because they are two figures which align themselves with the will of God, and people should listen to them. And Jesus, likewise, is someone you should listen to. Now, the reason why there was not a chariot of fire at the crucifixion has to do with, I think, kinds of suffering in our lives. And this is not something we often like to think about. I think of sunsets. Let's say sunsets. I don't know if you noticed the sunset on Friday night. It was glorious. I think the sunset last night was also glorious. And I looked at both of those sunsets and I thought, as I often do with a beautiful sunset, wow, that's glorious. And I throw that word around a lot, glorious. What I really mean, if I think about it, is God creates glorious things. And I look at a sunset and maybe it's quaint, but I will admit, I think of God every time, I think. When I look at a sunset, I think, wow, there is the glory of God. And sometimes, if I'm really thoughtful, I think, well, there is the glory of God. And there is a beautiful sunset over Oakland. And Friday night, I am sure, and last night, I am sure, there was great suffering and death and sorrow in Oakland. Not only in Oakland, but certainly in Oakland. And suddenly I'm tempted, like when I ask, where was the chariot of fire at the crucifixion? I might say, well, what does this sunset, beautiful, glorious sunset mean in the context of the suffering in Oakland? And here's where we have to make a distinction. I think of the rainbow in Genesis, also glorious. Well, that's in response to weather. You could say eventually it's a response to human wickedness, but essentially that story is about weather, natural disasters. There is suffering in our lives that we can do nothing about. Suffering from natural disasters, disease, and the fact that we all die. We are mortal. We all die. Like Elijah and Elisha, at a certain point, Elijah was going to leave this life, was going to die, was going to be taken up into heaven. One way or another, Elisha was going to be sad, and there was nothing to be done about it, right? That's one kind of suffering. The other kind of suffering is the suffering that we inflict on each other, isn't it? There's cruelty and injustice that we inflict on each other. The crucifixion is cruelty and injustice that we inflict on each other. And there's no chariot of fire. The sunset doesn't solve cruelty and injustice in Oakland. The chariot of fire, remember, is connected to actually aligning yourself with God's will, which is a will of mercy and love and justice. Right? The rainbow is a covenant that God makes with Noah and all people following Noah's paying attention to God. The transfiguration is the glory of God connected to Jesus aligning himself with God's will and preaching the good news of mercy and justice and love. So if the sunset and the transfiguration and the chariots of fire don't solve the suffering and injustice that we inflict on each other, that's because we already have what we need. We have Moses, we have Elijah, and we have Jesus, and we are to solve these things ourselves. And that's a hard truth. Now, the good news is that we do have confirmation of the glory of God in mercy and justice and love and compassion and patience. The transfiguration is placed right here before Lent for us as we head into a time of great thoughtfulness that does lead eventually to resurrection, but first to crucifixion. This is a good time for us to think, what are we doing to ourselves? What is the suffering that we sometimes complain about? We say, God, why don't you fix all the injustice in the world? And I think the transfiguration is part of the message to us saying, you have what you need to fix the injustice in the world. You have Moses, you have Elijah, you have Jesus, and if you want glory in your lives, you have it. It's there with you always. It's ready for you, but you're going to need to do the work. For me, we remind ourselves of this every time in services when we say either God be with you or the Lord be with you. Think about that. We say that all the time. What do we mean when we say that? What do we mean when we say it? And what does it mean when we hear it? Think about this for a minute. We might say, God be with you, and what we might mean is God the Creator, God the Father, God of the rainbow, God of the cloud and the transfiguration, God of glory be with you. Wonderful. We might mean God the Spirit be with you. God revelation, God inspiration, God the very stuff of life be with you. We might also mean God the human, God Jesus, God the friend, the companion, God the merciful, and the compassionate, and the just be with you. Which do you mean? Which do you hear? Now, our Trinitarian belief, as we are about to affirm in the words of the Nicene Creed, are that, of course, it's all of them. It is God, this ineffable, larger than life, Father, Creator. It is God the Spirit. It is God the Son. It is all of it. Which means that in the Transfiguration, we have God the Father. In the baptism, all the depictions of the baptism in the Gospels, we have God the Spirit, and of course throughout Jesus' life. And certainly in the crucifixion, we are going to have God the human who is left to die on a cross. And I think it is worth today and throughout Lent thinking about what we mean when we say God be with you. 2, remember that God the just is with us, and God the glorious is with us. God the Father and the Spirit and the Son are all together. And we need them all. We need the glory to be just, and we need the justice for the glory. They go hand in hand. So, today and always, in the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I say, God be with you.